Hello and welcome to the last lesson here in our cultural competency class, and that is one where we approach the issue of identity. And so let's get some terms right out there. Identity is the internalized schema of who I am. Now that schema is another term for idea, has been constructed over time, and it's influenced by our environment, our genetics, our education, our experiences, our physical bodies, our interacting with our physical world. It's influenced by race, sex, gender, age, all of these things. And it's a dynamic, moving, kind of gelatinous mass that is adapting to the environment. That's who I am. Now, unpacking that has been sort of a deal within the world of psychology since its inception. And one of my favorite ways in which that gets unpacked is the work of Carl Rogers. And this model is both a descriptive model of the self, but also a somewhat useful therapeutic model, because Carl Rogers was a famous therapist. So his ideas are largely applied theories, applying them to help people make change. So he identified that within that sense of self, in many ways regarding specific aspects of our identity, we can say that those aspects are categorized as being part of our ideal self, the self that we would like to be; social self, the self that we reveal to the world; and our true self that only we know. And we know that those three in different areas may be all aligned, which he called congruent, that I am this, I show the world this, and that's the this I want to be. That's who I want to be. But he also talks about incongruence, when those are out of order, and that this causes stress, distress, anxiety, frustration, where the world doesn't know who we really are. I'm not living up to what I would like to be, those kinds of things. And Rogers saw the therapeutic process and the aging process, these two processes, leading to greater and greater consolidation of those three, or alignment, congruence, as he said, between each one of those. Now, congruence comes around because of changes we can make in any one of those. Maybe our ideal self, we learn at some time that our ideal self is too high and unreasonable, so we change our ideal. Or maybe we age to a certain point that our public self, we're going to start being more real. Anybody who's ever worked with elderly people in an institution like a nursing home or anything probably has come across individuals who no longer really care what you think about them in some way, and they say it like it is to whoever's listening. And what we're seeing in that is a maybe uncomfortable but somewhat humorous example of when the real self and the social self are completely aligned. They're going to say it as it is. So that model, considering that model, we then look at the ways in which people are constructing their identities, and over time, at different throughout the lifespan, as they interact in our world. So we think about things like the issue of inequity. Now, we think about inequity that for reasons that are categorical, an individual is less able to accomplish something. And what I mean by that, structures within our society, structures within our socioeconomic system, structures within whatever, that designate that an individual has characteristics that are an important part of their identity, but yet those characteristics may become barriers to their success. You can look at the ones that are very simple. A person who has a disability will encounter not only the real barriers of their disability, but they will encounter the psychosocial barriers of the disability, the expectations of others, the expectations of themselves, people's viewpoints of that disability and what that person can do, what they can't do. Any one of those things, those become, even though that disability is a huge part of that individual's identity, it creates interactions with the real world that create barriers for their success. Then we can look at the divisive ones: race, gender, sex, all of those. Everything that can be discriminated against is a factor of our identity, unchangeable in many ways, that we encounter that creates barriers in our world. Sense of ourselves that creates in others a sense of distrust or a sense of unbelieving or lack of knowledge or whatever. Specific to that, certainly a large part of the conversation right now is the topic of gender. Now, I'm gonna make a statement here. Maybe there's some different opinions on this, but I don't think so. Well, I know there's different opinions on it, but I'm gonna make the distinction between sex and gender. Sex is dichotomous. There's only two sexes, male and female. They're defined by genetics. Even when somebody has different anatomy, different, even like say in there are genetic disorders like triple X syndrome or something that where the sex cells are not just XY or XYY or XXY and things like that. There is still a definition of male female. That's biology. When we're talking about diversity within that world, we're usually talking about gender. Now, genders is a continuum. There's not only more than two, there's theoretically an infinite number of different manifestations of that, because they take into consideration more than biology. There is perception of self. There's the physicality of somebody. There's the perception of who they are in the world. There's a perception of what an individual has learned are traditional viewpoints of male and female, and the degree to which they match how that individual feels when they look at their body and it's male or female. All of this is built around the social construct of gender, which is also manufactured. It is constructed by the individual over time. So I put in here a resource called The Genderbread Person, which is a really modern view of that captures the diversity of gender for us to have a deep understanding of that. I review some of the real challenges associated with some of these. There's some of this has become political. We'll go back to that, lesson 4, talking about politics. Some of these issues of diversity have become hot button political issues. They become some of those areas where you're not going to see where people are coming from. And so that can be pretty disruptive, and certainly from some political standpoints are really running against the sense of self that people have constructed, and it's scary for I guess I heard one time that we don't understand these issues of equity until a law has to be passed about who you are. So if you think about that statement, the law has to be passed about who you are to validate who you are. That shows where those issues are. So I'll admit I'm a white, straight male. There's never in my experience ever been a need for there to be a law to validate who I am. And that creates in me a profound inability to understand the perspective of somebody whose identity has had to be validated by law. So just a general sort of perspective and maybe understanding, maybe empathy for individuals who have had that experience. So the prompt in the discussion is we're going to talk about the incongruence part. Where are you incongruent? That theory of self from Carl Rogers. Difference between your ideal self, your true self, and your self-image or your public self. Getting some discussion around there. And for this particular assignment, it's a quiz. So there's a 4-question quiz. The first one, kind of repeating what you did in the discussion. Then I'm asking you to visit the interactive genderbread person and spend some time manipulating the sliders. Write a 1-paragraph reflection on this. You do not need to reveal your own conclusions about your gender identity. I'm not asking for that. You want to? Go right ahead. That's personal, that's private information. But just show the curiosity about how many different labels come up when you move those sliders around. It's kind of interesting to do that. Outline ways in which cultural norms, values, and/or expectations of persons with mental illness can represent barriers to success. That's kind of what I was talking about right at the beginning. Identify ways in which you can apply cultural competence in regard to the unique lived experience of a person with mental illness. This last piece is the cultural experience. Unless you have a mental illness or have had a mental illness and gone through the system and whatnot, we as providers, there's a cultural gap between having lived like that and having not lived like that, and with that piece of your identity. And I think that that's very important for us to be able to recognize in our day-to-day process. Me personally, I actually had some very, very important experiences in my life where the cultural difference between my life history and the life history of an individual with lifelong struggles with mental illness was made very clear, and without getting into the details of that, and it was a stunning revelation to me that transformed the way I did work, the way I approached the people I was working with to the better. And I wasn't necessarily doing anything wrong, but that perspective drove in a very deep respect and understanding for that difference that we have and how it shaped the way I interact with people who have mental illness, but also anybody who's different than me. It shaped the way in which I approach individuals who are different than myself. So that's it. This is our last lesson in cultural competency. I hope that you've enjoyed these lectures and the material that I provided. I look forward to the discussions and reading the assignments, and take good care and good luck in your career.